Hey everyone, thanks for coming. I think this is what, our 6th or 7th installment of the Static Website meetup. And 6, I've been told from over there. So yeah, I want to just start off today by saying a huge thank you to Wiki, who's been sponsoring the chow and the drinks and keeping the beer flowing and providing accommodations ever since. I think we only managed to do one in Netlify in our HQ by our own Billman, who started off talking more about the category of static tech in general. And then we moved over here. And I'm very, very happy to stay. And now we got a poster printed down in the lobby. I'm not sure if you saw it, so now it's official. You know, we're here to stay, because otherwise that poster was for nothing. So anyway, yeah. So most of these talks so far has been about static site generators, including the one today, which is very exciting because it's in React, sort of the framework of choice right now. Gatsby is new, but becoming popular very fast. And we have the creator Kyle to come in and talk about it, which is great. But yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the category. So these tools are very much in the center of this new way of static sites, but they're also just a part of what we're seeing. They're part of a new category that's been emerging over the last few years, but now is really getting legs to walk on. And we're going to do a meetup on it really soon. And really what it does is modern build tools, frameworks in a very Git-centric workflow, takes advantage of HTML5 and modern browsers to be able to create sites that can live and breathe on a CDN as static sites and then communicate to the API via the browser. So anything that needs real-time updating or anything that would be traditionally referred to as dynamic goes that way. And that, of course, leads to sites that are 10 times faster and have a time to first byte that's almost immediate and are way, way safer, because you're doing away with this cumbersome legacy backend that you guys all know from WordPress and all the other stuff, right? And that's also, of course, why we're all here today. It's really exciting to work with these tools. But things have really opened up. And we also think that there's a need to be able to talk about this category better. It's really a new stack. And in Netlify, where we do a platform that accommodates modern static site and then does everything around it, everything from continuous deployment, instant cache validation, CDN hosting, pre-rendering, all those things. It's sort of a Heroku for this new kind of stack. We often start off talking to clients where they spend 10, 15 minutes explaining a workflow that is around these tools that you guys are using, right? That is around React and modern build tools and Git and all these things. And we thought that we really needed some nomenclature. So some of the people that we've been talking to around this, both clients and advisors and industry leaders and the guys behind GitHub and Heroku and Rackspace and so on, and we've been talking like, how could we sort of present some terminology around this? And we came up with Jamstack, which is JavaScript APIs and markup. And our own Matt Billman just presented that on the Smashing Magazine conference that was just in San Francisco. Did any of you guys make it there? No? It was a great conference, by the way. Always is. And we'll be publishing more about it in Smashing Magazine soon. And he'll be hosting the next speak here and talking about this stack. And in general, we'll be widening it out. So not just talk about static site generators, but talk about the whole workflow. Everything from the hosting side of CDNs to modern frameworks, what can you do with these modern JavaScripts, to all these things that today you can actually do client side. Everything from comment fields to web chats to all kinds of dynamic plugins, right? And so we're going to try to widen it out. So of course, modern static site generators are very much at the part of it. But static is sort of a bad name for it, really, right? And because it's very much not static. At Netlify, more than 97% of the sites we host are not static at all. They're actually connecting to all kinds of APIs. They're e-commerce solutions, all kinds of stuff that's super dynamic, right? But they can live on a CDN, these sites, which is why we call it static. And so yeah, it's a brave new world. We love to hear your comments about it afterwards if anyone's sticking around to talk about this. And now getting back to what you're all here for today, which is Gatsby. And we're really excited. We've been working a bit with Kyle and what's that?
React.
Yeah, it's Gatsby. done with React, right? Static site generator with Gatsby. And without further ado.
Thank you for the introduction. And it's nice to be here today and talk to you all about Gatsby. So first, we'll do a little bit of audience questions, just so I kind of get to know who my audience is tonight. So who first has heard of Gatsby before coming here tonight? Okay, decent percentage.
You know that you were coming, so.
Well, yeah. I mean, like maybe before the meeting was announced. You know, maybe we'll go like that. Anyways,
You were the draw.
what?
You were the draw guy.
Thank you. Not too much praise. It's embarrassing. Who's used like React, like for realsies, not just played around with it? Okay, about a third of you. Okay, cool. So Gatsby. So a bit about myself, co-founder of startup. It's cool. You can check us out if you want. So a little bit about my history in building websites. Can I give a little backstory of Gatsby? So I started building websites back in like 10 years ago, I guess, 2006 or so, and using Drupal. And I actually got into Drupal for a while. Went to some Drupal cons and spoke there and so forth. And it was cool. I liked Drupal a lot. And then around 2011, I decided I really wanted to get into kind of JavaScript web apps, because that still is kind of the future. It's like that's where, most products are going. It's just richer and richer experiences on the web. The web is a brilliant application platform, and JavaScript's the way to do it. And so 2011, Backbone was kind of the thing to do that. And so I got into Backbone, and I joined a startup here in SF called Pantheon. And I worked there for several years and built out their dashboard using Backbone. And it was cool. It was like real-time, single page app stuff. Fun times. Learned a lot. So I was mostly just doing kind of JavaScript web apps around that time. But then around 2014 or so, I quit my job at Pantheon, and I was just exploring a ton of stuff. And I decided to rebuild my website, and static sites were getting really, really popular around then. So I was like, I'm going to do that. And there's the old adage that, you don't reinvent the wheel unless you want to understand how the wheel works. And so I decided to build my own little static generator, which I thankfully never published or put anywhere because it's really crappy. But it was this little gulp-driven thing, and it was actually pretty straightforward to put together. And I was like, oh, this is cool. I have a little template thing, and I have my markdown files, and I run it out, and it spits out a bunch of HTML files. This is cool. And super easy to maintain, super easy to use. I was like, I really like this. And I also started getting into React.js and Webpack and React Router and hot reloading around the same time. And I absolutely loved it because it kind of solved pretty much all the big pain points I had with Backbone. So quickly became a huge fan of React and its kind of surrounding ecosystem. And so also in 2014-ish or so, I started working on what became the startup I'm working on now. And so at some point we needed to build a website, and I was like, okay, I need a website. I don't want to do it in Drupal anymore, and I like static sites, but the one I built was crappy, but I also want to use React because I really fell in love with React, and it's just a really brilliant ecosystem, and it was just super fast and super powerful to do all sorts of complicated stuff. So I was like, how do I marry this React.js ecosystem I was developing that I'd fallen in love with the world of static sites where you just generate a bunch of stuff and you push it you push it out somewhere and it just kind of does its thing. And you really don't have to think about it anymore. And so I was like, with React, you can statically generate HTML. So I was like, what if I could somehow marry all these tools together in some sort of package that would make it really easy to build websites? And so I kind of obsessed over this idea for a while. And eventually in 2015, I decided okay, this just has to happen. And so I took a week off from startup work and I built version 0.1 of Gatsby. And shockingly, it worked. I had a little npm installable thing, and you could start a thing, and you had a little develop command, and everything just kind of worked together. And so I actually even kind of realized my goal even better than I hoped. Like, Gatsby is essentially, it takes Markdown or other static kind of like data sources, and it turns it into a single page app. And it also marries it with a pretty awesome kind of developer experience with like hot reloading. So on the left is my editor, and then, you save that, and then it reloads automatically. You can add some more content. Also see how the title changes as well. So it makes for a really nice kind of like developing editing experience, because as you're modifying your theme, as you're modifying content, you can see the changes live right in your browser, which just really, really speeds up kind of the experimenting with something and seeing if it works or not. And so bringing to today, we have we're up to almost 2,600 stars on GitHub. So if 3 of you want to start real quick, then we can get us over the edge. But even more important, I'm really proud. There's 33 contributors. So definitely developing a what do they call it, bus factor for Gatsby. So not just me doing stuff anymore, which is nice because I don't really have time to do a lot anyway. So that's great. Yeah, so 8 months old, but quite a few sites have already been built with Gatsby. This was my blog, the very, very first Gatsby site. This is my startup, and then another startup is using Gatsby, somebody's blog. This is an open source tool, etc. Okay, so now I want to get into more of the meat of the presentation, and I want to make a case for why Gatsby is the best choice 2016 for building websites. Perhaps just static websites, but if you're creative and clever, maybe you could do all your websites. So first, how do we choose tools? I assume everyone here is a developer or close to it. So kind of adept at using tools and thinking about tools and choosing tools. And there's basically 2 strategies for picking something. Given the constraint that it meets your requirements, you can either choose the most popular tool in a category, which has a ton of advantages because probably all the kinks have been worked out. There's tons of answers on Stack Overflow for whatever you need to do. There's lots of blog post tutorials, etc., etc. And so it's really nice to have just that kind of popularity to surround you with its warm, comforting embrace. And so that's what most people do. There's also kind of a secondary strategy which appeals to kind of more hipster developers who want to do something a little off the beaten path. And also it's kind of a nice recruiting strategy to pick a non-mainstream language, because you pick the right one, it can have a really smart kind of crowd. You can easier to hire from because you're the only company that's using that kind of niche technology. So that's kind of reason one, I think, why Gatsby is a really excellent choice for adopting in 2016, is that kind of much of the momentum in kind of the front-end world is moving towards tools that Gatsby natively supports. Stuff like post-CSS and Webpack and kind of component-driven web development, React.js and NPM, etc. So if we're looking at static site generators in a very broad sense and kind of comparing them to Gatsby, these are kind of different pieces that make up a static site generator. You have almost everyone supports Markdown out of the box, and so everyone does pretty much the same thing. It's you have Markdown and it turns down to HTML. There's nothing special there. Same with HTML templates. At the end of the day, they all generate HTML. It's kind of the same. CSS, most static site generators have pretty good support for CSS, so nothing special about Gatsby there. JavaScript, though, is where Gatsby starts to get interesting. Many static site generators, they're kind of this black box you throw in Markdown and out comes HTML at the other end, but they don't really have a good pipeline for, kind of doing more sophisticated, interesting JavaScript things. It's kind of this awkward, either you have a side process, which is handling your JavaScript, whatever. And so where Gatsby, on the other hand, it's at the end of the day, it's all JavaScript. And so doing more sophisticated JavaScript stuff with React is a very natural thing to do with Gatsby. You can actually have React components, which are like actual pages. And so you can have pretty sophisticated, complex like single page app type stuff that's like happening inside your Gatsby site. And the last piece is like kind of like component driven website development. This is like a huge trend. There's a ton of advantages to it. I'm not going to go into a lot here, but yeah, Gatsby again has first class support for that using again through React.js. And the really nice thing about this, I think, is that one thing about component driven development is that it allows you like in an organization to like share common components from like website to website, or even within the same website. You have like your different pieces of the website. You can like turn those into components and you reuse them across the website, and it adds a lot of consistency and like speeds up your development a lot by kind of having your own little tool chest of components. Yeah. So a bit about kind of the goals of the Gatsby developer experience. A, batteries included. B, so there's this. So kind of like Gatsby has this concept of like boilerplates or like starters that you can install. Well, right now they're called starters. I could probably go call boilerplates soon. But anyways, it's like you kind of have partially built sites that you can then kind of like start from, and then they're very hackable, very easy to modify to like kind of meet your needs. And like Gatsby has 3 official starters or boilerplates, like a kind of a kitchen sink, just to like demonstrate a bunch of stuff, and then a blog, and then a documentation site. And something that's coming soon is a little more sophisticated version of that, like tentatively called like Gatsby apps, which would be, say there was like open source documentation site, which is like a really common thing. Like you have some sort of open source tool, and you have like a little home page, splash page type thing, and then you have like a little docs section and so forth. Well, Gatsby, you could have kind of like, you could abstract a lot of that functionality into an NPM package that, has like a template, has like, like a kind of like a theme. And then if you're building a new site that's kind of like a documentation site, you just do npm install that, and then all you'd have to do is add like some markdown files for your documentation, and then like a home page, and then everything would just be kind of otherwise be taken care of for you. And it could be like a community maintained thing and so forth. So there's a lot of interesting possibilities there. Because I think it's like tools that win are ones that allow like kind of a community to collaborate around common stuff. That was one of my big problems with Backbone, is that it was very hard to share like stuff, like components, like Backbone components that you built with other people. But where React is like getting a lot of its popularity from is actually very easy to share React.js components, push into NPM, and other people can use them without much modification. And that makes React really, really powerful because, now maybe 25, 30, 40% of your site can be those community maintained components. That percentage is just rising. And I think with Gatsby 2, as it gets adoption, there can be more and more of these like boilerplates and apps or other kind of like pieces of sites that are really common from like site to site to site that can be community maintained and that you can just get out of the box. And then the hot reloading piece, again, is a huge boon to development. Like I've been using it for a year and a half now or so, and I can't really imagine not having that available anymore. Another nice thing about Gatsby is just like if you've done any React development, it should feel very, very similar. And the last is, just that, Gatsby's powerful. I mean, Gatsby by itself is not that special. It's basically it's like kind of a glue project that kind of like glues things together. So most of its power is the fact that it like makes easily available, kind of like I was talking about earlier, like all the little ecosystem pieces that kind of go into it. So kind of the goals for the Gatsby user experience is that it's just very fast. Like pages should, like all static sites, it should have just the minimum amount of stuff that needs to load to like have a get to the screen very quickly. But more than that, like Gatsby sites, like it loads all the content needed for subsequent pages. So once you load the site, you like click from page to page without any page reloads. Like actually, I'll demo that real quick. So like if you go to like my startup's website. So you click on About, there's no page transition. It's like almost instantaneous. And that's because when the site loads, it loads a JavaScript bundle which has the code necessary to go from page to page plus the content. And so it's a really good user experience. And then also, this isn't built in yet, but service workers are super exciting. They offer really sophisticated kind of like client caching. Plus, they also make like offline experiences actually really easily, which if any of you ever tried to do that before, research that. It's been pretty much impossible on the web. But service workers actually makes it pretty straightforward. And so I want to build into Gatsby a way that's kind of like a one-line configuration, basically to enable service workers and offline support. Okay, so I got a good time actually for questions. Anyone has any quick questions? And then I'm going to demo some, just like what it's like building with Gatsby. Yeah.
How well does it work with search engines?
Just fine. It's a static site, so I mean every page is. So I mean when I was showing you. So I was showing you this, like there's no transition, but each of these pages also, so it has like a single page app version, but also each individual page is a separate HTML file. So like if I reload this, like it reloads the about HTML file from the back end and then loads the same single page app in. So it works just fine for search engines. Yeah, now in the back.
Did you bake in back and history support as well?
Yeah, so the question is there like kind of back button support? And yeah, it's using, so under the hood it uses React Router, which is a really popular, React Router, as the name suggests. But anyways, yeah, it has like really, really good support for back button stuff. So yeah, if you can go back and forth, no problem. Other questions? Yeah.
So when you want to go beyond Markdown and maybe describe something more complex in the markup, do you have any way of handling that? Someone want to go away and describe something more complex?
Yeah, I'm going to show it a bit in the demo, kind of the kitchen sink, which will show all the kind of out-of-the-box supported file types. But it's very possible to add more support. And Gatsby's soon going to move to a plugin architecture, which will mean that like Gatsby core will have like a few plugins for like common file types supported, but you can like create a plugin for like ASCII doc or something, or any other format that you can think of that there's an NPM module to support. But anyways, which is pretty much everything. But anyways, yeah, and you'll be able to like install that and like have very easy support for other types of Markdown type languages. You had a question here? Or maybe not. Any other questions? Yeah, then back.
Just a little unsure of where the React part comes in. Is that at like build time or something? Or, the React part in the Gatsby app, it's, I know you're using it to build the actual end result HTML. So is it just at that level, like where it's combining the Markdown and the data and spitting out HTML?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the basic architect, so from like a data flow perspective, what Gatsby is doing is this first step is to collect data. And so that could be from a Markdown file, it could be from a JSON file, it could be from a web service, it could be anywhere. And it like collects all that, and then it like basically has a system of matching different like page data blobs to then React components. So Markdown files all get sent through the same like React.js Markdown wrapper. And so everything in Gatsby eventually gets run through a React component. Either it like starts as a React component and it just like goes direct, so it's like a direct conversion, or it starts as like some sort of like data source and then gets run through a React.js wrapper component. So this is a so if we go to Gatsby, as I was mentioning earlier, there's several starters that you can use to start with. And so I installed one of those, and now I just run gatsby develop, and that sets up the development server with the hot reloading and so forth. And so now we can just go to localhost 8000. Okay, so this is the kind of the kitchen sink demo that like shows all the kind of available options for like file types. And so yeah, if we go here, kind of see like, you know, a bunch of like markdown stuff is supported, code highlighting, anyways, kind of normal markdown stuff. And then, as I was mentioning earlier, it has native support for kind of like JavaScript components. You just like drop a JavaScript component inside your pages directory, and it'll get turned into a file. And so this is like generated static. I mean, there's a static representation, like a static HTML that's generated from this. So if I turn off JavaScript, this will load like this. But because the included support for the JavaScript bundle loading, now it has like a fully working, you know, React component that gets loaded automatically. Same thing with CogScript through Flavor. You can also just have raw HTML, and that's supported. Then, kind of fun too, it has full support for JSON, YAML, and TOML. So this is what the raw JSON file looks like, and it gets turned into this page. Same thing with YAML and TOML. And then also has like post CSS and Sass and less support, so so forth. So okay, so some basic structure. So Gatsby sites, they have kind of like a root directory, and it has like an HTML page, which is kind of wraps every page, and it's just a JavaScript. It's just a React.js component, and then there's just like your package JSON and a few other stuff that's like optional. Oh, and has like a config TOML, etc. But yeah, all the pages go in the pages directory. So if we go there, here we can see, here we can see kind of like the different pages that are converted into these different ones here. So we have like this markdown.md, which turns into the markdown file. You know, we have the like coffee React and like the React.js, and then like the toml.toml, yaml.yaml, etc., etc. And all these are just like either they're raw data files. Like if we look at the JSON one, for example, it's just a JSON file. And if we look at the YAML, it's just a YAML file. If we look at, say, the CoffeeScript file, you know, it's just a normal kind of CoffeeScript React.js component. Yeah, and so to kind of your question earlier about like, do you have raw power? It's like, yeah, you know, it's just all React code, so you can do whatever you could in a normal React component. And also Gatsby has a decent API now for like doing other like kind of extending like kind of like other extension points. So like if you want to like after the site is built, if you want to generate an RSS feed, for example, there's like an API hook for that. And I'm going to be revamping the API soon, which I'll be talking about in a bit, which will add like a lot more extension points for doing custom modifications. Yeah, and then like the HTML page is just HTML and so forth. So perhaps I think it'd be interesting. Well, first let me show like the hot reloading. So this is the index.js. This is a React.js component which generates this page here. So we have like up here it says hi people. So if we say hi static web meetup peeps, and then we save that, it'll just hot reload. And you say welcome to your new, try it again, awesome Gatsby sites. So that's cool. Anyway, so that's pretty straightforward, and this works for like CSS too. But also, like if we go to like the Markdown file, and then we go over here, then say, what do you think? You know, same thing. It's like even though we're editing Markdown, you know, same hot reloading. Cool. So yes.
Yeah, question: what happens if you screw up?
Scroll up.
Screw up. Error.
Oh. Yes, that's actually a great question. It's almost like you're a plant or something. So what if we have like a syntax error in our JavaScript? See, will this trigger it? Oh, there we go. Yes, it doesn't happen for all errors, but for a lot of errors, there's this really cool kind of error overlay that shows up while you're, you know, developing your JavaScript code, and like have the whole error stack up right there. Is that what you're asking, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Anyways, and then over here, like, oh darn, we mistyped the import, so we correct that, and then back to normal. So yeah, so and this is like, and none of this is what I've done. Like, this is like really complicated stuff that like really smart people have spent a ton of time figuring out. And like Gatsby, because it's just being built on top of like the React, Webpack ecosystems, it just gets to like kind of like take all these like really, really nice developer tools and bring them in to kind of this out, you know, this experience. So it might be helpful to like go through how like Gatsby takes a raw Markdown file or raw any kind of file really and like runs it up into, you know, this final output. So if we go to this Markdown, so this is like a very normal Markdown file with front matter and so forth. So, you know, if any of you have built static sites, you've seen this 1,000 times. So Gatsby uses Webpack loaders to convert Markdown into something a React.js component can handle. So a loader is basically a conversion script. Like it takes any sort of like raw input and loads it into a JSON file. So it turns something into JavaScript objects. So if we look at the, let's see, should I forget? Yeah. So if we look here, the Markdown loader for the site, if we kind of skip down here, so we have this module exports. This is kind of the meat of it. So this module.exports, it gets the content, which is like every Markdown file is passed into here. And then it first extracts the front matter up here. And then it uses a tool called MarkdownIt to render the Markdown string. And then all of that's kind of combined together, the front matter and now the HTML that's been rendered from the Markdown into this result, and then it's returned. So it's really, really simple once you're kind of used to this pattern, and it's really powerful because like with Webpack loaders, you can take any file basically that's almost like anything. Like you could take like an image, you could take basically anything, and like analyze and turn it into data, and then make it accessible and like turn it into pages. So yeah, so that's the first step, is like take the Markdown file and turn it into, and parse it and turn it into a JavaScript object. And then Gatsby internally, it like associates every like file type with a wrapper, which is a React.js component. And they just go in this wrappers directory. And yeah, and it's just a one-to-one association. So if we open up the Markdown wrapper, you can see that this is the React.js component, and in here in the render function, so if you're familiar with React, like all components, when data is passed into it, it's like passed on this props object. And so Gatsby passes the data for each page on this.props.routes.page. And so we're kind of like taking that out onto this post object, and then we just return this very, very simple structure where we have div, class name is Markdown, and then we set the title from the front matter, and then we just set the rendered post body here in this div, and out it comes. So really simple pattern, but it's really powerful and kind of easy to tweak and modify to kind of fit whatever need. For example, if you had a much, like say you had, really like you had like a whole bunch of different markdown files. A lot of static site generators have like a theme like key that you put in your front matter. So on this, you could just have different. You could just kind of like switch over the different themes or something to render out different React.js components depending on what type of markdown file it was or something. So if we look at like the JSON wrapper, it's like extremely similar. It's also taking the data off of the page.route.page, and this it's also setting the title, and then it's just stringifying the JSON. So if we go out here, we kind of look at this where it like takes the title off the JSON object that was on the file, and then just has the raw view of the JSON. It just stringifies it out. So as you can see, it's like it's exactly the same as what was on the file. Yeah, so this is interesting because like JSON support's interesting because there's a lot of like third-party systems where you could like, just do like a bunch of API calls and pull a bunch of information and dump it in like, as pages in a Gatsby site and then automatically generate a site from that. Which is kind of an interesting possibility. Yeah. Cool. So, questions on all this stuff? Yes, Matt.
Yeah. So, one thing I've been wondering with the sort of generating it all as something that also turns into a single page app is how well it scales to really large sites.
Mm-hmm.
You have 1,000 pages or something like that. Like how will Gatsby handle that?
Yeah. So it has a mixed performance right now. So there is one community member I think has like a 10,000 page Gatsby site, and so the only way to do that right now is basically turn off the Gatsby, like turn off generating the JavaScript bundle of like that has all your pages in it, because I tested with like 5,000 pages and it generated like a 2 megabyte gzipped JavaScript bundle, which is a bit much for most sites. But there's a way though to make it quite scalable. Webpack supports something called code splitting, which is basically you can have, basically you can like split your JavaScript bundle into as many segments as you want. And so Gatsby would be able, this isn't built yet, but Gatsby would be able to say only create JavaScript bundles that are like maximum of 500 kilobytes, for example. And so when you kind of like land on a page, like say you go to the home page, it would just load the JavaScript necessary for like that page or maybe like a few pages around it, that's necessary for that. But then you navigate to another part of the site, like React and React routers built so that you can asynchronously load like additional bundles, like JavaScript bundles in the background. And so we would be able to say like, okay, you're now going to like the docs section of the site, which JavaScript we haven't loaded yet. And then behind the scenes, just put off a request for that JavaScript bundle, and then it would like pull everything in without again any page transitions. And it should be quite quick on most connections. Like say there's like another like 200 kilobytes, that should only take less than a second. So it should still be like really, really quick, even loading stuff like that in the background. Anyways, and with that technique, like Gatsby should easily scale to very, very large sites. It might make sense to even build in like more. Oh, also one other thing that could be interesting too is that Webpack has support for parallel building, and so each of those chunks could be built in parallel to some extent, and that would speed like the build of like very large sites. Yeah.
Do you implement generation from a database?
The question was like, does Gatsby support generation from database? Not natively. The plugin architecture that's coming, you would be able to have like a plugin that like hooks directly into your database and loads stuff. that gets generated as file. But right now what you'd need to do is basically you'd have a script which would say connect to the database, pull out all the information you need, and write out like JSON files into your Gatsby pages directory, and then it would work. But yeah, so it's definitely doable, and it'll be better supported soon. Okay, so so Gatsby was like very much still kind of is kind of an experimental thing. Like I just did it because I was like, oh, maybe this is possible. And it turned out it is possible. But whenever you're like, I mean, as all of you know, it's like when you're prototyping something, it's oftentimes, almost all the time, not ideal in a lot of ways. And you learn a lot by prototyping something, building something out that, then informs, if you have enough time and money and don't have other pressing things, to actually build it right the second time. And so, so Gatsby has some like weaknesses. It's very much, it's kind of monolithic right now. It's a little bit hard to modify. Too much stuff is in the core. It's like a little too opinionated, which is like has its plus sides because it's like out of the box. Like if you're working within its constraints, it works. But it's a little too opinionated. Kind of like pulls too much in. And it doesn't have like as many extension points as I'd like. So kind of been thinking about the last several months and like with conversations with other people and kind of like seeing like feature requests and so forth. How I'd like Gatsby to go next is first kind of revamp like the data transformation pipeline. So I've been describing it in this talk, as like you kind of like collect data either from files or APIs and whatever else, and then like kind of like pass it through this like processing step where eventually it all gets turned into like React.js components and then into HTML in a JavaScript bundle. And that's kind of like the idealized version of things. It's not nearly that clean right now. And so I want to rewrite it so it's like actually in code it's that clean as well. And then at each step, in that process, they're like kind of like before and after hooks, that you could like slip in and like do something like, oh, like at this point in the data transformation step, I'm gonna like have this like little function which like goes through and does this modification or something. And this would be great both because it would make it easy to extend your own site, but also like common like tweaks could be like turned into NPM modules, which you could install. So like say you wanted to have some sort of like special, URL structure for your files, for example. Like you want to do whatever, but you wanted the end URLs to be like cleaner. You could have like a plugin which then you install, which like transforms the URLs for each page into what you want it to be. Or like RSS feed generation. Like right now you kind of have to like handwrite that, and like it's kind of a pain, but it's a pretty common thing. So anybody doing a Gatsby blog, there should be a RSS plugin which you install and generates an RSS feed whenever you build the site. So it's like that data transformation. The plugin API have really clean support for like kind of like pulling these plugins from NPM and installing them. And then also kind of like I was talking about earlier, like the idea of having Gatsby apps, which is you could have a blog that all you do, that like the only thing inside your, like the only source you're controlling is like the markdown files, which I think would be ideal for a lot of sites, that like you can just like install it, maybe have like a configuration options which you tweak, and then you just start adding content. I think that's the ideal for a lot of things. Yeah, and so this is kind of how I'm thinking the plugin app API whatever structure would work, where you would have like these like apps which are kind of like basically bundling together plugins and templates and like React.js components and wrappers and so forth. You could like add you could add those, and then you could have plugins, like you could have like the Gatsby Markdown plugin and like the Post CSS plugin, and then these plugins then could take like configuration. So like for Post CSS, what if you wanted CSS modules? Well, then you just like turn that on, and then the last thing like post build, like this is an example of like how you'd like extend your Gatsby site through the built-in API. So you'd have like a post build hook, so that once everything was finished building, you'd be passed like an array of pages, like the data for each of all the pages, and then you'd be able to do whatever you want with that. So that's the presentation. So yeah. Cool. So comments, questions, feedback? So the question was, do I see Gatsby being used for very large content sites? And yeah, right now, you'd probably top out around 500 to 1,000 pages is where Gatsby could easily do. But the pathway for making it work on like sites of any number of pages is very straightforward. It's just somebody has to do it. So
what is that pathway?
It's basically set up code splitting. So the main bottleneck is Gatsby turns all your content, like combines all your content into the JavaScript bundle so that you have kind of that single page app experience once it's loaded. Like all the content's there in your browser and you just click around and it's all there. But at 500,000 pages, it's starting, that JavaScript bundle is starting to get pretty big, more than you'd normally want to load into your site. And so, but there's a process with Webpack where you can like split up the bundle and asynchronously load like different bundles as you navigate around the site. And so you'd only need to load you'd only need to load one of those bundles when you first open the site. And then if you like navigate to another section of the site, it would then load in the background the JavaScript you need for that section of the site. So it's very doable. It's just this is a side project for me, and I don't need it. So I'm waiting for that brave community member to step up to the plate and make it happen. Yeah.
What kind of person do you see being the user of Gatsby in the future? I mean, like, is it converging towards non-programmers or developers? It can't really satisfy everybody, right?
Yeah. Right now, it's a little bit rough, and yeah, it takes decent amount of development skill to like do something interesting. But I don't see any reason why with like kind of the Gatsby app concept that I was talking about, that even people who know very little about programming shouldn't be able to build sites with Gatsby, where you could almost have like kind of like a WordPress type install experience, where you would install a blog or like a little small business, Gatsby app, and then you would just go in there and edit the content, because you'd kind of have like some example stuff that you could like, okay, here's your homepage, and like here's like a splash image or whatever, and you just go in and like modify what's already there. And so even relatively unsophisticated people technically should be able to build stuff with Gatsby down the road. I mean, just like the WordPress ecosystem has like gazillions of people building websites with WordPress who aren't developers by any stretch of imagination. Like, I don't see why not with, I don't see why that can happen with Gatsby.
Could you only build React sites with it, or could you use it to build an Angular site or something else? I don't know how you do that, but just curious.
Yeah, I don't know how you do that. Yeah.
So it's mainly for React.
Yeah. I mean, you could probably, well, I don't know if Angular has, so to do with Angular, I don't know if Angular has the concept of like rendering to HTML, like static HTML outside of the browser environment. So I don't know, you could do this with Angular. I know Ember has that capability now with their fast boot stuff, so you could build the Ember equivalent of Gatsby if you wanted to. But yeah, it's Gatsby's for React though.
In result site, the site you're building.
Sorry, what?
Not the actual tool, but the site you're building, the actual end result site. You could have it be whatever, right?
No, it depends. It depends entirely on React. I think you can embed Angular inside React components. So if you really wanted to have Angular for some reason, you could make it work. But yeah, it's not supported.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was awesome. A static site that's a single page app. All right, thank you so much to Kyle for coming and sharing his thoughts and ideas and work. It's really, really great work. Yeah, as we mentioned, we run static site, staticgen.com, which is the most popular online open source directory of static site generators. And together with Hugo, which is a static site generator made in Go, Gatsby is definitely just flying up there. It's really becoming very popular, very fast. So yeah, thanks again for spending your evening with us. Thank you everyone for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next time.